The temperature had already fallen to 17 below zero when Clara Edmonds heard the sound that didn't belong. It was past 9 in the evening, and the blizzard that had been threatening since midday had finally committed itself to the Montana high plains with a cold and total fury. Clara was alone in her homestead cabin, 4 miles northeast of the small settlement of Dunmore, tending the last fire of the night and listening to the storm carve itself against the walls. The wind had been steady for 3 hours, a grinding, relentless pressure from the northwest that found every gap in the chinking and drew cold lines across the floorboards. She had already checked the livestock twice that evening, pulling her coat tight and leaning forward against the gale to cover the 40 feet between the cabin and her small barn. The animals were uneasy but sheltered, and she had packed the door seam with a doubled length of burlap before coming back inside. She was not a woman given to fear, not at 31, not after 4 winters alone on this claim. But even Clara knew what a storm like this could do to a person caught in the open. What she heard was not the wind. It was a pounding, faint, irregular, desperate. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled open the door against the resistance of the gale, and the cold hit her like a wall of iron. On her porch, half collapsed against the frame, was a man. He was large and broad-shouldered, and he had 2 small boys pressed against his sides, one under each arm, their faces turned into the rough wool of his coat. All 3 were coated in snow, their eyebrows white with frost, their lips the pale color of creek ice in February. The man looked at her with eyes that had gone glassy with cold and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he needed to come inside. Clara Edmonds stepped back without a word and let them in. She had been on her homestead claim for 3 years and 11 months, which meant she had proved it up in the autumn of 1886, just 3 months before that January night. The 160 acres sat in a shallow basin where a seasonal creek bent northeast, and the grass there grew thicker and longer than on the open benches above. Her husband Robert had filed the claim in the spring of 1883 and had broken the first 12 acres of sod before the typhoid came that summer and took him with a speed and indifference that still felt to Clara like an insult. She had considered going back east, back to her family in Ohio. She had written the letter and then torn it twice before folding it into the stove. She had stayed, not because she was stubborn, though she was, not because there was money in the land, though she believed there would be eventually. She had stayed because leaving felt to her like admitting that the 4 months Robert had worked that soil had counted for nothing. She had learned to plow and to harvest, to read the sky and the wind, to judge a horse by its breathing and a storm by its color. She had neighbors, though none close, and she had built a reputation in Dunmore as a woman who kept her word and her accounts both neat and current. She was not rich, but she had not lost the claim, and in that country, in those years, that was a form of wealth in itself. The man on her floor was named Elias Vane. She didn't learn his name until he had been inside 20 minutes and the color had begun to come back into his face. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair salted at the temples and a jaw that was either naturally square or had been rearranged by old violence. His hands, once he had pulled off his gloves, were large and calloused in the particular way of men who had worked cattle for years, the rope callus at the base of the fingers, the scarring from 1,000 small encounters with wire and frozen metal. His boys were 7 and 9, named Samuel and Thomas. Samuel was the younger, and he had cried silently the whole way in from the door to the fire, not from any specific pain, but from the relief of warmth, which in extreme cold feels identical to pain for the first several minutes. Clara did not ask questions. She gave them blankets first, then heated milk on the stove with a little molasses stirred in, which was what her mother had given her as a child when cold had settled into her chest. She checked their fingers and their feet with the practiced attention of a woman who had treated her own frostbite twice and knew what the white patches meant and where they would turn when the blood came back. Samuel had the beginning of frost damage on his right ear and the first 2 fingers of his left hand, the skin pale and waxy at the tips. She rubbed the hand gently between her own until she felt the tissue soften, and the boy winced but did not pull away. The elder boy, Thomas, watched everything she did with a careful and evaluating attention that reminded her of his father. They had come, Elias told her later, from the direction of the Granger Road, which ran south to north along the western edge of the valley. He had been driving a light wagon with the boys to reach Dunmore before the storm closed in, and the storm had moved faster than the barometer at the trading post had suggested. The horse had gone lame 3 miles south and then refused to move at all in the wind, and he had unhitched her and let her stand, trusting the animal to find her own shelter, and had carried the boys as far as he could follow the fence line north before the line ended, and there was nothing but white in every direction. He had walked toward the faint orange smear of her window light without knowing whose light it was or how far it actually was. He estimated he had been walking for 40 minutes, though he admitted it could have been 20 or could have been more than an hour. The cold does that to time. It makes it elastic and unreliable. Clara listened to all of this from the other side of the fire, where she was heating a pot of salt pork and dried beans that she had been planning to eat herself the following day. She did not tell him that. She ladled it out in 3 portions and set them on the table and told the boys to eat slowly. The storm did not let up that night, nor through the following morning. By dawn on the 15th, the temperature outside had dropped to 29 below zero, and the wind had not diminished. Clara had checked the barometer twice in the night and watched it fall with the kind of steady, patient descent that old homesteaders called a hard drop, meaning it would not reverse quickly. She had enough wood inside the cabin to last 4 days at normal burning, 2 days at the rate this cold demanded. She had provisions for herself for 2 weeks, which with 3 additional people became perhaps 5 days if she was careful. She was careful. She rationed without making it visible, serving the boys the larger portions and eating less herself without remarking on it. Elias noticed. She saw him notice, the slight tightening around his eyes when he watched her eat, the way he looked at the woodpile, and then at the window, and then back at her without speaking. He was not a man who spoke without purpose. She understood that within the first few hours. He watched and calculated in a manner she recognized because she did the same thing. Twice during the first full day, he offered to go out and check the animals, and she let him, watching through the window as he bent into the wind and crossed the yard with the careful, deliberate movement of a man managing his own heat, knowing that unnecessary speed costs more than it saves. He came back with snow packed into the creases of his coat and reported that the cow and the 2 horses were standing, that there was adequate hay, and that he had broken the ice on the water trough with the iron bar he'd found hanging by the door. She had not asked him to do that. He had thought to do it himself. She adjusted her opinion of him slightly upward and said nothing. The boys occupied themselves with the limited materials available in the cabin with a self-sufficiency that told Clara something about their ordinary life. Thomas found her copy of Gould's Agriculture Reference Manual on the shelf above the fireplace and read it for an hour with genuine attention, stopping occasionally to ask her questions about crop rotation and soil amendment that were more sophisticated than she expected from a 9-year-old. Samuel drew horses on the backs of old correspondence with a nub of pencil, and his horses were good, recognizable in their anatomy and their posture, drawn with the confidence of a child who has spent real time observing the actual animals. Neither boy complained. Neither boy asked when they were going home. They understood, in the way that children raised in hard country understand, that the question had no useful answer, and that asking it would only borrow trouble from a day that already had enough. Clara found herself watching them with a complicated feeling she did not spend time naming. She had wanted children. That was one of the things that Robert's death had quietly taken. By the second day, something had shifted in the quality of the silence between herself and Elias Vane. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been tested by the same circumstances and found each other adequate, which in that country was a form of trust. He had repaired the split leather of her trace harness using a length of rawhide he cut from his own coat lining. She had not asked him to do that either. She had noticed the harness was split 2 weeks earlier and had been putting off the repair. He had simply seen it hanging and done it. If you find value in these stories of frontier character and survival, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. These are stories of ordinary people meeting extraordinary conditions with preparation, intelligence, and an unshakable will. Your subscription helps keep these accounts alive for the generations that follow and ensures that the hard-won wisdom of the frontier is not lost to time. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally dropped. Not gone, but reduced from its sustained assault to something intermittent and survivable. The temperature was still at 21 below, but the sky had lightened to a pale gray that suggested the worst had passed. Clara made coffee from the last of her grounds and divided it 4 ways, giving the boys the portions with the most heat and the least actual coffee. She stood at the window and assessed the drifts, which had built against the north and west walls to a height of nearly 5 feet and had buried the lower half of the barn door. Elias stood beside her, close enough that she could see his breath. He was quiet for a moment and then said, his voice level and matter-of-fact, that he owed her more than he could easily say. She told him she had done what anyone would do. He said, in the same level voice, that he had been in this territory for 9 years and knew that to be untrue, that not everyone would have opened a door in a storm for a stranger and his boys, and that she should not diminish what she had done by calling it ordinary when it was not. Clara did not reply. She looked out at the white and broken landscape and thought about the horse he had left on the road, which had been worrying her since the first night. She said she thought they should go look for the animal when it was light enough and the wind was down. Elias turned and looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize, and then said that was the first thing he had been going to suggest. They found the horse 2 miles south, standing in the lee of a low cut bank, snow-covered and cold, but alive and sound on all 4 legs. The lameness had been a stone bruise on the left fore that the cold and the rest had reduced to a mild tenderness. Elias examined the hoof with careful hands and pronounced her fit to walk, which she did, following them back toward the cabin with the grudging compliance of an animal that has been through something and resents being reminded of it. The boys rode her turns, Samuel first, sitting straight and easy, in the way of children who learn to ride before they learn to read. Clara walked beside Elias, and they did not speak much, but the silence had a different quality now, lighter. The silence of people who have shared something and come through it. The sky above the plains was the particular blue that comes after a plains blizzard. A blue so clean and deep, it seems almost aggressive after days of gray and white, the world scrubbed raw and starting over. The cabin, when they reached it, looked small against the drifts, half swallowed by the storm's work. But the smoke was rising from the chimney where Elias had rebuilt the fire before they left, and it rose straight in the still air, and Clara thought that the sight of her own smoke against that blue sky was one of the more reliable forms of beauty available to a person in that country. It was when they were back inside, when the horse was settled in the barn and the boys were eating the last of the dried apple she had been saving, that Elias Vane told her something she had not known and had not thought to ask. He told her he owned the land, not her land, not her claim, but the land to the east and north and south of her claim, the larger parcel that surrounded her homestead on 3 sides, the bench land and the creek bottom, and the timber section at the northern edge of the basin. His family, he explained, had acquired it in parcels over 7 years, beginning with his father's first purchase in 1879 and continuing through his own additions in 1883 and 1885. He had been based out of the family ranch in Miles City and had been in the process of building a permanent residence on the Montana holdings when his wife had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1885, and the boys had needed him in Miles City, and the building had stopped. He had been coming north to assess the property, to decide whether to resume building or to consolidate. He had not known when he walked toward her window, light in the blizzard, whose light it was. He had not known there was a proved-up homestead claim in the basin at all, which meant the land office records had not reached him, which happened in those years more often than it should have. Clara sat across from him at the table and listened to all of this with the careful, expressionless attention she gave to information that required her to think before she responded. The boys were by the fire. The horse was in the barn. The storm was over. She was thinking about what it meant that the man she had pulled from her doorstep, frostbitten and barely standing, owned essentially everything around her. She was thinking about mortgages and land values and the particular vulnerability of a widow's claim surrounded on 3 sides by a single owner. She was thinking about whether any of that changed what had happened in the past 3 days, and whether it should. Elias watched her think. He did not rush her. What he said next was not what she expected. He said that her claim was hers by right and by law, and by the work she had put into it, and that he had no interest in pressuring a claim that had been proved up honestly. He said this in the same level, direct manner he said everything, not as a man trying to reassure a frightened woman, but as a man stating a position he had already decided on and was not open to revisiting. He said further that the basin land to the north, which was presently unused, bordered her hay meadow at the creek bend, and that he had been considering whether a lease arrangement for summer grazing rights might benefit both parties, if she was interested, if the terms could be agreed on fairly. He said this last part carefully, as if he understood that he was moving into territory that required a different kind of care than the conversation that had preceded it. Clara looked at him for a moment, and then said that she would need to see a map and the land office descriptions before she could have any meaningful conversation about terms. He said that was entirely reasonable. She said she was not in the habit of making agreements in winter kitchens after 3 days of storm, and that she preferred to conduct business in the light of better weather and better information. He said he thought that showed good sense. There was a pause, and then she said that regardless of all of that, the boys were welcome to finish the dried apple, because she had nothing else to do with it, and the winter was mostly past. Samuel looked up from the fire at the mention of the apple, and then looked quickly back down, and Thomas allowed himself a small smile that he did not entirely succeed in hiding. Elias Vane said, "Thank you." He said it the way a man says it, when he means something larger than the words contain. They left the following morning, the hoarse sound in the air, cold but calm. The boys bundled in the quilts Clara insisted they take for the ride south and return at their convenience. She stood in the yard and watched them until the low scrub at the creek bend hid them from sight, and then she stood a moment longer in the cold silence of the aftermath, listening to the land settle back into itself the way it does after a storm, a kind of vast, collective exhaling. She went back inside and looked at her cabin the way a person looks at a familiar thing after a long absence, noticing it again. The fire was low. The woodpile was reduced to what would last 2 days comfortably. The provisions were lean. The harness was repaired. The water trough in the barn had been broken out and refilled that morning before they left. And the barn door had been cleared of the drift that had been half burying it since the first night. She sat down at the table and was quiet for a while, not thinking about the land or the lease arrangement, or what it meant that Elias Vane owned the surrounding acres. She was thinking about the moment she had opened the door against the storm and found them on the porch, the man and the 2 boys, and the decision she had made in the space of a half-second, the decision that required no thought at all, because it was not the kind of decision that thinking improves. She had opened the door because there were people outside in the cold, and she had warmth inside, and the arithmetic of that was simple enough that she had not needed to calculate it. She had not known who they were. She had not known what they owned. She had not opened the door because of anything except the fact that it needed to be opened. The lease agreement was signed in April, when the ground had softened enough to walk the boundaries together, and when Clara had reviewed the land office maps in Dunmore and satisfied herself on every relevant point. The terms were fair, she judged. She had negotiated 2 of them upward from his initial offer, which he had accepted without argument, and she had taken that as a further measure of his character. The summer grazing arrangement worked well, and the following summer it worked better still, and by the 3rd year it had become a settled feature of the basin's economy. The cattle moving up from the south in June and back in September, the grass recovering cleanly, the creek staying clear. Thomas came back to the cabin with his father that first April and returned the quilts, which had been laundered and folded with a precision that Clara suspected was the boy's own work rather than his father's. He brought back the Gould's agriculture manual as well, which she had forgotten she'd lent him, and he had marked 3 pages with folded corners and told her, with the grave seriousness of a 9-year-old who has thought about something carefully, that he thought the section on soil amendment was incomplete in its treatment of nitrogen, and that she should look at the paper by Professor Hilgard from California that he had found a reference to in the bibliography. Clara looked at him for a moment and then said she would do that. She did. He was right. Samuel brought a drawing he had done from memory of her 2 horses standing in the barn doorway, rendered in pencil on a clean piece of paper with a sureness of line that was remarkable in a child of 7. She kept it, pinned above the fireplace, where it remained for many years. The winter of 1887 is recorded in Montana's territorial archives as one of the most severe of the 19th century, part of the broader pattern that ranchers and historians would later call the Great Die-Up. The catastrophic winter that broke the open-range cattle industry and changed the face of Western ranching permanently. Tens of thousands of cattle died across Montana and the Dakotas that winter, frozen in coulees and along fence lines and in the open grassland that offered no shelter against the sustained cold. Families who had built for milder conditions found themselves burning furniture and outbuildings to stay alive. The communities that survived intact were those that had prepared, that had built with the land rather than in spite of it, that had understood that generosity and cooperation were not soft virtues, but hard practical necessities in a country where the difference between your neighbor's survival and your neighbor's death was sometimes as simple as whether you opened the door. Clara Edmonds had opened the door. She had done it without knowing what it would mean, without calculating what it might return to her, without any awareness of the land holdings and the lease arrangements and the years of fair dealing that would follow. She had done it because the night was cold and the porch held 3 people who needed warmth, and that was reason enough. That is still reason enough. The frontier did not reward sentiment, and it did not reward recklessness, but it rewarded something that contains elements of both and exceeds either: the willingness to act on what you know to be right before you have finished calculating whether it is also useful. Clara knew what was right before she opened the door. The calculation came later and confirmed it. That is the order in which these things should happen, and it is the order in which they did. The cabin stood for 40 years after that January night. The basin it occupied, the land that surrounded it on 3 sides, was managed with care and with the kind of long patience that good land requires. The people who lived and worked there across those decades were connected by the particular loyalty that comes from having shared the worst a winter can offer and come through it together. That loyalty is not sentimental. It is structural. It is built from the same materials as the land itself, from cold and difficulty and the simple, repeated choice to treat another person's need as a sufficient reason to act. Clara Edmonds made that choice in a half-second on a January night, while the blizzard tore at her roof, and the barometer sat at the bottom of its range, and a man she had never seen was pounding on her door with the last of his strength. She made it without hesitation. The rest followed from that. The rest always follows from that. If these stories of frontier character and hard-won survival wisdom speak to something in you, subscribe to this channel and help keep this knowledge alive. Every week, we document the forgotten lessons of the men and women who built this continent with their hands and their minds, and their refusal to turn away from what was difficult and necessary. These stories are worth preserving. The people in them were worth remembering, and the principles they lived by are as sound today as they were on the Montana plains in the winter of 1887. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier life. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the circumstances, the survival challenges, and the human principles at their core are drawn from the real documented history of homesteading on the American frontier.